Hey Ronald, thank you so much for joining us today. I know you're a brand new father. Just had a baby a couple weeks ago, a couple days ago, or
1 week ago.
1 week ago. Okay, so but thank you so much for your time. I know in between feeding and changing all that, you'll get very little sleep. But thank you for joining us today. Today, I wanted to talk to you about estate sales. Recently, I think just with the way the market's going, there's a very little inventory. Not a lot of people are selling their primary residences. What we spoke about before, we're seeing a lot more estate sales coming on the market. Some of our clients and agents too are sometimes um, or it could be the first time or they're not too familiar with that whole process. So I just wanted to go through some general procedures with you on how to deal with estate sales in particular.
Sure, absolutely. And to preface our conversation today, so I don't practice wills and estates law, so I'm not an expert when it comes to estates procedures or
Mm-hmm.
anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I do a decent number of property sales for estates or estates going through the administration process. So I have some general knowledge.
Okay, perfect, perfect. Yeah, so most of the questions will be pretty general today,
Hmm.
regards to, like the sale process and what to look out for. And I guess anyone who has wants to take a deeper dive could speak to like an estate lawyer or something
Absolutely,
like
yeah.
that. Okay, perfect. So the first question is just a very simple, like, what is an estate sale?
Okay. An estate sale is basically where the owner of the property has passed away. And basically, the beneficiaries of the estate, they want to sell the property to distribute the assets among the beneficiaries. Um, the assets are generally either distributed in accordance with the will, if the person who has passed away had a will when they passed, or if there isn't a will, there are default rules of intestate, which kind of also um, decide how any assets would be split after as well.
Okay, perfect. So, what are some of the general procedures for an estate sale? For example, one of the owner passes away. What are the steps that are kind of followed or required prior to a property being listed or sold on the market?
Hmm. So generally speaking, because the owner is no longer here, there isn't anyone who is by default kind of authorized to sign on behalf of the owner. Um, it has to go through a process to get a document that's called the Certificate of Appointment of Estate Trustee, which basically names a legal authority for a specific person or a specific set of persons to deal with the estate, including any property that's owned by the estate. So in the event, for example, if somebody passes away, generally speaking, the first step that they should do, or not them, the first step the family or the descendant should do, is to have an estate trustee appointed. They should try to begin the process to apply for a certificate of appointment of estate trustee as soon as possible. That's usually the bottleneck for dealing with any assets,
I see.
whether it be distributing assets from bank accounts, selling properties, distributing assets that way, even transferring properties. You need to have that certificate in order to do it. Generally speaking, it's good for the family to look to see if there's a will.
Hmm.
If there's a will, of course, it'll discuss like how the proceeds of any kind of assets would be distributed. In addition, usually the will state who will be like the initial executor trustee.
Okay.
If that person is named in the will, it's usually much easier for that person to get the certificate. It'll make the process a lot quicker,
Okay.
a little bit, more painless.
Hmm.
But there are cases where the person who is being named may not necessarily want to act as an executor or trustee, or there might not be a will in certain cases. In those cases, you'll still have to apply for a certificate of an appointment of a state trustee, but the process may be a little bit more complicated. It'll take a little bit longer time, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So a lot of the listings that we see on MLS, on the brokerage remarks, will say, probate is in the process or probate received.
Mhm.
Can you explain exactly what a probate is?
Sure. So probate is the process in which the estate of a person who has since passed away is administered. In that probate process, they have to go through, getting the proper authorities to sign on everything. That's the application that we were discussing before.
Hmm.
In order to do so, there's quite a bit of documents and applications that have to be submitted through the court. Part of this is getting the certificate, and then because the person is no longer here, in order to get the certificate, like to sign the documents, they have to go through that process.
I see. Okay. So how is how do you apply for the probate? Like, how do you start that process? Like, do you have to um, get the first document you talked about, the executor of the will, to.
Yeah, so in order to get the probate certificate, it's a court application. It can be fairly lengthy, depending on the situation, depending on the assets, that kind of thing. There are a number of forms that have to be completed for the court forms, and there's a number of documents that are required, such as the death certificate, a will if there's anything like that. Sometimes there's amendments to wills and just further details. The courts may ask for an explanation as to why the specific person should be executor or trustee. In situations where the assets are very large or the person who's being appointed as the estate executor or trustee is not named in the will, there's something called a bond that may need to be basically signed. The bond is like a guarantee for the person who's signing as an executor or trustee. They basically have to sign a form saying that they're going to be personally liable if there's any issues with respect to the estate. There's insurance sometimes that people purchase in the event something goes wrong, any disputes with the estate, that kind of thing. And then in the application process, you also have to pay what's called the estate administration tax. A lot of people also call this probate fees or probate tax.
Right.
There's a formula to calculate it, but basically beyond a certain threshold, I believe it's around 1.5% of assets.
Okay.
So the amount can be quite significant. This amount needs to be paid into court before the certificate is granted.
Okay.
So sometimes where the assets that are trying to be distributed are very significant, especially when we're talking about real estate, that kind of thing, it can be a significant amount of money that first needs to be paid into court. So that has to be figured out as well. And then in order to get the certificate, they also have to provide like a list of assets, an approximate valuation of all of the assets, so that the tax can be calculated and paid.
Okay. Yeah. So generally speaking, can you sell a house prior to receiving the probate certificate from the court?
You cannot close the transaction before receiving the certificate. The certificate is the final kind of legal authority which appoints the person to sign on behalf of the state, so it cannot close. There are cases in which it can be listed on MLS, and even an agreement of purchase and sale can be signed. But in situations where that's happening, realtors, and clients have to be very careful. At the end of the day, we want to ensure that any agreements have the proper clauses to properly disclose that it's an estate sale. It's conditional on the certificate being received, and there might be extensions if there's delays with respect to the court process to do the application and get the certificate. We also want to avoid situations where, for example, the person that the realtor might be dealing with is holding themselves out to be a signatory for the estate or a representative of the estate. And then at the end of the day, for whatever reason, if there's a dispute or something like that, that person never receives the certificate of appointment of estate trustee, then effectively that person would not have the legal right to sign any contracts on behalf of the estate, and that can get quite complicated as well. So it's generally better to have the certificate before the entire process is started. In some cases, you can start listing beforehand, but you would have to be very careful. You would definitely want to get additional proof, such as like a will or something like that, that names a specific person as an executor or trustee. But if you want to just err on the safe side,
it's better to wait for the probate.
The certificate.
Okay.
And that's why the certificate is usually, it's the first step. So if, any realtors, they have clients coming to them saying, like a family member passed away, we want to sell their property, the first question and the first step would be, you should start the application to appoint an estate trustee.
Okay, so that was going to be kind of our last two questions is, the best practices for a listing agent really is if they're approached by a client that says, someone passed away in my family, we're looking to sell this property, the first question they should ask is,
do you have a certificate of appointment of estate trustee?
Okay.
And if not, has that process been started?
Okay.
It's best to just ask for as many documents related to that as you can. As an a listing agent, you want to make sure you've done your due diligence and you're protected as well. So asking for like a copy of the will is useful. Asking for a copy of the death certificate. It's also good for the clients to prepare all of these documents anyway. All of these documents will be required for the probate process, and it'll be required by their lawyer for closing to ensure that there's the proper authority to sign all of the documents.
Okay. So basically, if the listing agent, if they get the probate certificate, then it's that's
Yeah.
a lot more straightforward than
Yeah.
anything
If the certificate has already been received, then that person is like the courts have appointed that person
Okay.
to be the authority for the estate, and then that's the listing agent's obligations are essentially fulfilled at that point.
Mhm.
Then it would just be treated as any other kind of transaction from the agent's perspective. And then the person can sign on the behalf, can close as necessary. The funds are handled usually a little bit differently. So that's something for brokerages to be aware of as well.
Okay.
Generally speaking, it's best if the funds are paid into an estate account, as opposed to for example, any personal account by the named trustee, just to avoid any kind of potential like misunderstandings
That's
or
right.
misappropriation of funds
Right.
or mixing of funds, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
It's also very recommended for clients that when they're starting the process to sell these assets, that they also go to the bank and set up a specific
Separate account on that.
separate estate account that will handle basically all of the assets, like
Okay.
receive funds, pay out any expenses for the estate, that sort of thing.
Okay.
These types of accounts are special accounts that are set up with banks
Mhm.
that have kind of certain rules and regulations regarding them and last for a certain period of time. So it's important to set that up. Best practice would be to only pay into accounts that are, clearly estate accounts,
Right.
issue checks that
Right.
are in the name of the estate,
Mhm.
not, any of the trustees or executors.
Yes, you're not mixing it up.
Yeah, you're not mixing it up. Like you don't want to issue, the check to the named trustee, just in case there's any issue with funds.
Any
later
disputes
on.
or anything. Okay, that's a great point. So last question is any best practices if you're a buyer or a co-op agent looking to, your client's looking to purchase an estate sale.
Mhm.
What are kind of some tips that you can provide and what we should be looking out for?
So the first thing is when you're dealing with an estate sale, the closing date is dependent on a lot of factors. It's best to ensure that the clients themselves understand that closing can be moved. The agreement will typically have clauses that make it conditional on receipt of the probate certificate,
Right.
which both makes it that the closing could be moved, and in hopefully, very few narrow cases that sometimes the transaction may not necessarily go through if there ends up being an issue with the certificate of appointment of estate trustee or the probate process, or if there's a dispute within the estate or beneficiaries as to whether the property should be sold.
Right.
So in that way, purchasing an estate property is not necessarily as straightforward. It's not necessarily as certain as purchasing other kinds of property, especially going in with like a firm offer or something like that.
Right.
But of course, there are also other benefits.
Yeah.
To
Okay. So
purchasing.
with the estate sale, if they have not received the probate certificate yet, it'll always be conditional on receiving that
Yes.
probate certificate.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there's usually also like a clause that allows for the seller to unilaterally extend
Right.
the closing date if a certificate has not been received by a certain point.
Mhm.
So it's just important to know as a buyer, like for setting up, your mortgage, everything like that, that there is a chance that all of these relevant dates could change.
Okay.
Yeah.
So your closing can be extended, kind of,
Yeah.
So there's no like set date on that side.
Yeah. I
Okay.
mean, usually you can set a limitation on the maximum amount of days that it can be extended, and if it needs to be extended beyond that certain point, then the deal kind of falls through.
Okay.
But again, that's kind of an issue as well.
That's a little bit of a risk too.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Hey, thank you so much, Ronald. I think that's a great overview of estate sales. If anyone has any questions, we'll definitely put your email at the bottom in the description as well. And thank you so much for your time.
Sounds good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Ronald.